So yes, I reversed my vitiligo. How did I do it, and what do I do now if I get a flare-up? Let's go over it. Before we do, I'm Samir and I'm a health coach and a PhD student. What we're going to be discussing in this video is how to make lifestyle changes to control or reverse autoimmune symptoms. Lifestyle changes can be an extremely effective way to control autoimmune, but only if we stick to them. And sticking to lifestyle changes requires support. If you have friends and family who can support you through this transition, do reach out to them. And sometimes that's not enough, so I'd urge you to consider working with a health coach. That is the best way to maximize your chances of success in reversing autoimmune disease. If you're looking for a health coach, my contact details are in the description below. So let me begin by sharing my vitiligo story. When I was about 12 or 13, I developed these big white patches on the skin of my shins. I don't really remember how long they took to appear, but it was kind of overnight. Like one night they weren't there and then the next day they were. I did have some injuries in that area because I used to play soccer. But if you look at the scars from soccer and the vitiligo patches, they don't really match up, right? So it probably wasn't any physical injury. It was probably diet, stress, genetics. This is what generally plays a role in people developing autoimmune disease. Now, my parents weren't really sure what to do about it in those days. I'm talking about 1989. So no one had heard of vitiligo, or very few people had. And autoimmune disease in general was fairly rare, certainly not as common as it is today. So they did try to get me treatment, which was basically to do a kind of light therapy. I still remember the waiting room for the place where I went to get my light therapy. Most people had much worse vitiligo than I did, right? So they had it on their face, on their arms, all over. And the thing that struck me is I would look at these folks after months or years, and I didn't see any noticeable changes in their vitiligo. So they were getting the therapy, but it wasn't really working. But I was a young kid. I wasn't going to question it. So I put on the dark glasses. I stood in the circular tube for, I can't remember how long it was, 15 or 20 minutes. And I did that every week. Maybe it was a couple times a week at some points. I don't remember. But I did it for many, many years, up until I went to university. There was no real change in the vitiligo. If anything, it was getting worse, right? I didn't continue the treatments when I went to university, in part because they didn't seem to be doing anything, but also because the vitiligo wasn't really bothering me at that time. It was staying on my legs. It wasn't really visible. Sometimes I would get funny looks on the beach or in the swimming pool, but not really. It wasn't really bothering me. I've talked elsewhere about how when I went vegan in university, that seemed to slow the spread of the vitiligo a little bit, and how when I went carnivore much more recently, it was the first time that the vitiligo actually reversed. Since then, I'd say my vitiligo is under control. It's not growing, but not really shrinking either. It's just sort of staying where it is, more or less. And in case it does start growing, I now have the tools. I now know what I need to know in order to reverse it because I've done it before. Okay, so what did I do and what can you do? First, remember that vitiligo, like all autoimmune disease, begins in the gut, right? I won't go over this in a lot of detail today, but what's thought is that, when we eat something, certain kinds of foods can cause the tight junctions in the lining of our small intestine to become loose. So there's little gaps that open up, tiny little gaps in the small intestine. When that happens, food particles, so foreign particles, can get into the bloodstream, which triggers a massive immune response, right? Remember that 70% of the immune system is in the gut. And if that gets overactive, it can begin to target parts of our own body. So that's the definition of autoimmune disease. Auto is self, immune meaning it's the immune system that's targeting the self, right? In the case of vitiligo, the immune system targets the melanin pigment in our skin cells. In the case of other autoimmune disease, for example, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, that targets the thyroid gland, right? Okay, so it starts in the gut. What can we do about that? Well, if it starts in the gut, we have some control over what we eat. And we need to eat things that will support our gut health, will make those tight junctions come together so that nothing triggers us. And we need to also know what our triggers are. So our food triggers can vary from person to person, but the most common trigger that we see in nearly everyone is the gliadin protein of wheat. Now, this is known to open those tight junctions in a lot of guts, even people who don't have celiac disease, which is a gluten sensitivity, or a gluten allergy rather. So this is sometimes referred to as non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And I suspect that nearly all people with autoimmune disease have it to some extent, right? Okay, so wheat and other things that contain gluten are kind of a no-brainer to exclude. In terms of other things, we find that for some people, dairy is a trigger. Beans, which contain other lectins, can be a trigger. So gluten itself is a lectin, which is a class of anti-nutrient found in some plants. Beans have other lectins. Some of those can also be a trigger. Actually, almost anything can be a trigger, so it helps to do an elimination diet. In some ways, the simplest elimination diet, but it's also a very restrictive elimination diet, is a pure carnivore diet, right? So eating nothing but meat. Now, if you're doing a carnivore diet for elimination purposes, I would actually recommend you start with just meat. So no eggs, because egg whites are known to trigger some people. No dairy, again, lactose and casein are known to trigger some people. But it doesn't trigger everyone, so you can add those things in. So maybe do just meat for a week, and then add in eggs, and then add in dairy. See if it triggers you. If your symptoms get triggered, then now you know what to avoid, right? And here's a study showing that there is a link between non-celiac gluten sensitivity and autoimmune disease, and there's ongoing research on this as well. The second thing I'll mention here is vitamin D, either in the form of sunlight or in the form of supplements. What I notice is that in the summertime, when there's lots of sun and my vitamin D levels stay high, the vitiligo stays under control. Sometimes it even reverses without me even thinking about it. In the wintertime, if I'm not careful about supplementing, it can get worse. Now, I think vitamin D supplementation may be a good idea for all autoimmune conditions, but it is definitely a good idea for those who suffer from vitiligo. Vitamin D actually plays a role in the process known as melanogenesis, which is how our body makes melanin, or the pigment that's missing when we have vitiligo, right? This paper talks about the role of tropical vitamin D cream, something I personally know nothing about, but it does seem to be the case that making sure the blood vitamin D levels are high also helps. The last thing I'll talk about is actually the most important, and that's stress. So I think if I think back over the years and I see the times when the vitiligo has really gone out of control, where it's come in a new spot or the existing spots are growing and growing, those have all been associated with times of stress. So for example, when my daughter was born, my partner and I weren't sleeping much, as any parent of a newborn can tell you. And during that time, the vitiligo started to spread for the first time in many years, right? And a few years ago, when we were moving from one country to another, my partner also had some health issues around that time. I had some health issues myself. So there was a lot of stress. The vitiligo got really bad, and I even saw a spot or two on my face. It's well understood that stress can aggravate autoimmune symptoms, so this isn't a revelation. Now, in my experience, just making sure that you're not stressed is not enough to reverse the disease process, but it's impossible to make gains if you are stressed, right? In other words, just sort of doing things to reduce your stress levels may not reverse the process, but at least it won't spread, right? A lot of what stresses us out is at the subconscious level. So if you feel like you're stressed, working on your exercise, so you're sort of getting that energy out of your body, working on your breath work, working on your meditation practice, these can all be really helpful. So those are 3 things that I do to reverse my vitiligo: get rid of the food triggers, make sure my vitamin D levels are good, and reduce my stress levels. As I say, these lifestyle changes are not always easy, and it helps to have support. If you'd like support from a health coach, my contact information is in the description. Thanks, I'm Samir, and I'm a health coach and a PhD student. I'll see you next time.